to welcome today our two speakers, and that they are Marirose Steigerwald and Patti Gillenwater, who spent a wonderful evening on an inn near Wilson's house. Wilson, thank you for sponsoring that. It's great to check out. They're here from Raleigh, so we're really we're in for a treat. You know, one of the big issues that we have is succession planning, and who's going to be there when we're not there. And so I'm very excited to hear from them what their experience has been. And they've got some handouts and cards. We'll end at 1:25, including questions, but they'd be glad to stay and talk to folks afterwards. And they also have an announcement, so I'll let y'all do your introductions. Welcome.
Well, get over here. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us. This is absolutely my favorite place in the state. And my husband and I often come here for the 4th of July. You have the best 4th of July downtown, I tell everybody. And just love being in the mountains and in your wonderful area. So I'm Patti Gillenwater. Elinvar is an executive search and leadership development firm. I'm the CEO, and Marirose Steigerwald is our president.
And you have to have really long names to work with.
Can I stop, because the commercial part is important.
Okay.
Would you say a little slower what your firm does?
Sure. Okay, we are executive search, and we have been in existence since 1986. We started out in the for-profit world, and we have morphed in the last couple of, say, 5 years into the for-mission world. And we really started ramping up our focus in the for-mission world about a year ago. We have a wonderful philanthropist in our town named Chuck Recor, and he is starting to figure out how he wants to give back, and he's very passionate about leadership at the board level. So what he started doing is funding scholarships to send chairs and vice chairs of nonprofits in the Triangle to Harvard. Hence the Harvard and Hard Knocks. And so this time last year I was studying furiously, case study after case study of amazing nonprofits and what they had done and what their leaders had achieved, and feeling very unworthy, and that, whoa, at my age I have not done nearly enough good. And so fortunately Marirose, we still don't know why, but was having the same epiphany, and so we sat down when I came back and we said, this is what we really want to focus on. This is the work we've enjoyed the most. We don't feel schizophrenic anymore because she and I both have spent a lot of time serving on boards, and you know, it's that I've got to do what I promised my community I would do, and I have to run a business. And so anyway, we're just thrilled that it's coming together. We're not nearly as schizophrenic. Not saying we're sane, but we're not nearly as schizophrenic as we used to be. So is that about
yes,
thank you. And so we have 2 jobs to let you know about. Annie suggested that we let you know about some searches we're doing that might be of interest to you or people you know. You want to talk
Sure.
about?
The first one is the Vice Chancellor of Institutional Advancement at North Carolina Central University. And I don't know if you're familiar with this school. It's a historically black college university, an HBCU, and they have a new chancellor in Deborah Saunders White, and she is probably a 5-foot-tall hurricane and has big plans for the school, lots of energy, lots of intelligence, lots of enthusiasm, and she's looking for a development partner, an advancement partner to run no less than 120 miles an hour beside her to make the changes that are needed in the school. It's a great campus, very welcoming, a lot of passionate people, and we're seeking the right person for that role. It doesn't have to come from the university advancement world. We are excited that she's very creative. So if anybody has any ideas, we welcome them, and you'll have our cards. We would welcome hearing from them.
The other position that we're just launching, so please don't ask me details, is with Danville Regional Foundation. They are bringing in a senior program officer to work in the area of health and human systems. And this is a position that really has not existed for that foundation for a couple of years. So it'll be a really great building from the ground up kind of opportunity. And you do have to live in the footprint of Danville and the counties that foundation is. Okay, so let's get going. I need the thing.
Okay, so this is hopefully an informal group.
Yes.
I like the energy in here, so bear with us because we are technologically challenged and we're actually having points. Okay, so once upon a time, there was a nonprofit board and whose members of the board came from a single focus of healthcare. They also had an executive director who was getting ready. She was toward the end of her career, and she was basically retired in place. That may be a familiar scenario. Everybody on that board was very passionate about their mission to serve children. And since they came from a single focus of healthcare, they were in the middle of talking about a project that they had where they were going to distribute car seats for families in need. And the conversation went to the distribution method to give away these car seats. And there was a very heated conversation about how do they get these car seats to these parents. And there was an even more heated conversation about how do they get people with no transportation to the distribution site to be given these car seats. So there was a fundraising consultant who happened to be sitting in the room with them in that board meeting. And she asked the question, why do we want to distribute car seats to people who don't have cars?
So glad you got that joke there. It took the board a minute or two, but they did finally get it. So fast forward a little bit further, and the next big decision that needs to be made by this board. And they were an advocacy organization. They decided, with their single focus of coming from the healthcare sector, that they are an advocacy position. They did not float it anywhere. And they single-handedly, with that one decision, lost every corporate donor. So, this is our passion about leadership in nonprofit world. It's very unique, we believe, from what we've seen in the for-profit world, because you're relying just as much on your volunteer board as you are on your paid leader. And really, we often see that it ebbs and flows, right? You can have a very enthusiastic board that can get worn out, and then it goes the other direction. And the same thing with our EDs and presidents and CEOs of our nonprofits. And so, what we believe is really important and critical for sustainability for our nonprofits is to have really great leadership consistently with both parts of our leadership duality that make for success. And as fundraisers, we're hearing more and more that your funders are asking this. They're asking, do you have a succession plan? There are a lot of articles being written. There was one in Charlotte this summer that I don't know if you get the Charlotte press or pay attention to it, but they had a big article talking about all of the leaving the nonprofits in Charlotte. And I don't think it's quite the Chicken Little that they try to make it sound like, but it is true. And just like in all parts of our country and leadership, we are aging out, and some of us are not ever going to leave our jobs, but others are going to go into retirement. And so we think it's a critical issue and important to you as development folks. So hopefully that's why you're here and you agree. So, do you have any questions or comments about this as we get into this?
So our agenda today is kind of simple. We really are going to focus on two things: how to build and sustain an effective board, and then how to design a CEO succession plan. And those are two simple things, formal, as we talk. Head nodded. Kind of keeps us going. So we just feedback. So how to build and sustain an effective board. It starts with the board members. Who do you have on your board? And usually they come from varying areas. You often get your business leaders, people who serve in corporations and serve on boards as either a community relations service or because they have a passion. You get experts in the field in which you're working, like our car seat gang. They were all experts in their fields. You also often need technical experts, attorneys, accountants, HR professionals, marketing professionals, pretty much whatever the direction the board needs. And then you also have your community service people. Maybe they're retired, maybe they're stay at home, but they have a passion for the cause and they have the time that they want to give and serve on your board. So our car seat friends, and that's what we're calling them from here on out, they truly had the experts in their line of work, and the area where they missed it was the business leaders and the technical experts. Because if there had been somebody on that board, first they would have said, before the conversation went down the giveaway car seats to people who have no cars path, what are we trying to accomplish here? And clearly with the advocacy portion, if they'd had a marketing person or a business leader in that organization, they would have said, let's check with our constituents. Let's make sure that the stand we're taking is what the people we are representing really want us to do. And unfortunately, they were so excited and single-minded that they just kept going and lost all their corporate funding. So it's an interesting study with that board. So that's all good. Now you know who you want. Well, how do they act when you get them there? And board behavior is something that can make or break an organization. And I'll tell you a little story. It's a very painful story of one of my experiences. We had a board that we were building that was becoming more and more engaged and more effective, and we were seeking leadership. We were looking at leadership succession. And there was a new board member there who was clearly very passionate about the cause. And she was very verbal in our board meetings. And we thought because of that, because she was so sparkly, and I know we all know sparkly people, that she would be very effective in a leadership role in the organization. So we tapped her really early. And quite frankly, through confessions, we tapped her too early. We didn't give her time to prove herself before asking her to serve in the succession. So she is in the succession role, ready to take part. She was on the executive committee, and all of a sudden we realized that the sparkle and the passion was really anger. And there were many times in board meetings she would hijack the conversation and bring it back to where she wanted to see change. And her change happened to be going back to the past. Back to the day when the organization was something very, very different than where we were presently and where we were headed. And I would watch the room, and we had a pretty large board. There were about 25 people on the board, and sitting in a giant horseshoe like you do. And that's tough to keep everybody excited in that moment anyway, but I was watching the faces, and as she would tell her stories and hijack the meetings, people would glaze over, and they'd stop talking, and they'd start doodling. They'd start checking email, and we'd lose them. And we lost all of our forward momentum. So we realized in a very painful way that we could not continue to have her in the succession plan. And I gotta tell you, that was probably one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. As a volunteer, to ask that person to step aside. It was our fault because we placed her too quickly without her proving herself. It didn't go as positively as we had hoped it would. But we had to do it because the effect on the organization would have been devastating if we had allowed her to move ahead. So we learned a very long, painful lesson. And we learned to pay attention to sparkly people and to realize that the passion might not be what the behavior is important.
So don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Yeah. So board development is critical to succession planning for a board and for an organization. And the word that keeps popping in my head when we think about board development, and the word came up in the introductions, is intentional. You know, a lot of times we're looking for breathing people. That's not always good. Breathing's good. That might be a little more than breathing. But really think about what your board needs, what your organization needs. In one I served in, we were doing a major website redesign. So we knew that in a leadership role and on our board, we had to have somebody who got that and understood and could actually guide us through that process. We had the budget, happily, thankfully, but we didn't have the expertise. So we intentionally recruited someone who was a marketer and understood web design and could project manage it. And it enabled us to get the project done in about a year, which is in the land of websites, that's a pretty short amount of time. And it was very effective. So we intentionally recruited and selected a marketer. So figure out where the organization is going and what kind of talents and skills you need. And when you're selecting board members, it's a recruiting process, just like it is when we do executive search. You know, you tap into who you know, you tap into who knows who, you check their brand. Does their brand align with your organization's? You check references. And mostly, you give them an opportunity to kind of work it out in a committee level, perhaps, that's what I learned, to prove their leadership before putting them on the board or even considering them for any kind of leadership role. Has anybody had experiences with this? So you want to share?
Well, I had the same woman on my board. that you had. And, so I was there going, and she finally said, I mean, I had to talk with her and saw that her vision, told her that her vision doesn't align with the vision with the rest of the board members in the group. So she stepped down. It was painful. It was, she hijacked meetings and, yeah.
And funny, I was researching that very topic, and I think I told you this. I was searching removal of board directors, and oh my, lots of pages come up with that. But ironically, most of the situations are with homeowners associations. And I don't know, I mean, probably 10, 15 pages of results, it was all homeowners. So I just thought that was ironic. And I'm going to tell on you. Patti, who serves in so many leadership roles and gives so much of her time, about that same time decided to join her homeowners association. So when you attract the right members, you select them just as if you're recruiting for a role, and always keep the pipeline when you're interviewing these folks and you're checking their references and doing kind of the background checks. You always keep in mind: is this person a potential leader for our board? Because I don't know if you've had this happen, but a lot of times we've served on boards where you look around and the president's rolling off, and you look around and there's nobody to succeed them. But if you do it intentionally, you build as you go and tap into the leadership ability early, then hopefully there can be a succession pipeline. And then once you got them, onboard them, just like we do in our organizations. Every organization has a language. They have buzzwords, there's structure, there's the things everybody knows because we've been here so long. Acronyms. Oh yes, and I've heard a lot of letters today, there's a lot of acronyms. So have an official onboarding process, an orientation. If you have bylaws, teach them the bylaws, teach about succession, talk about opportunity. And when you're talking to them, and I got to back up, recruiting, talk about your expectations of them as a board member. Everybody's expected to give time, talent, and treasure. And depending on the organization, those things can vary in what you need. But if you have the conversation before someone agrees to come on, there's no surprises. I've served on a board where we made a transition from time and talent into, oh my goodness, we now need your treasurer. And of course, everybody goes on board first for the treasurer. And it really upset people because when they agreed to join, way back when, they didn't know there was going to be an expectation of giving. But because their leadership, of course we expected that they start doing it. So as we recruited, we had that conversation up front, and you get very specific. What are you talking about in terms of time? Is this that hilarious, oh, just one meeting a quarter? That's, that recruiting thing that we all do, one meeting a quarter. Or is it going to be we meet every month, outside of the meetings, this is what your responsibility is, but get very specific. Have a job description for a board member. And that sounds crazy, but it's all about making sure they're engaged and know what's expected of them. And keeping them engaged. Keeping a board member engaged to stop the doodling in the meetings. Have good meetings. I don't know how many times we were sent information ahead of the meeting, copious amounts of information, and in the room went over that information. And it was very redundant. And it's kind of like performance management. All it takes is one time where you don't go back over it over and over again. You expect to have a robust conversation, and you call on somebody to participate, and they look at you with the deer in the headlights. They'll come to the board meetings prepared from there on out. Because you want in the room, this is your board. These are your leaders. You want them to be able to really talk about things and make decisions. Yes.
I have a question, and maybe it's obvious, but people that we choose to be on our boards with us, they're on other boards. This is not their first rodeo.
Right.
Why is it that it's unfathomable to them that they might have to give of their time and their talent? I'm completely perplexed. Can you explain that phenomenon?
Well, number one, humans are messy. That's kind of our mantra at Elinvar.
I mean, I agree you need to educate them
Yes.
and tell them that up front. I think
Right.
that's
And it's all
brilliant.
about expectations. But there are some people that choose to serve on boards to build their own resumes. And you know, when I hear someone's on 10 boards, I go, what, you know, why? What can you do successfully on 10 boards? And that's a resume builder. There are people who choose to serve on boards to give. There are people who choose to serve on boards to share their expertise. So you've got to be really clear about what the intention is of that person on that board. And that's what the recruiting comes in. You find those who can. Back to the sparkly people, there's other sparkly people that come in and they're very sparkly and they say, oh, I can do that, and then they never do it. But they're sparkly. So it's, you know, you get past the sparkle and find the doers.
You know, when you were talking about that you actually check references, so are you asking them for other boards that they've sat on, and are you calling those organizations and asking about their performance on those boards? As opposed to, I mean, what kind of references are you asking for?
It's a little bit more informal than that, and certainly, I mean, we can do it informally in the triangle as big as we are, so I'm sure that we were able to do that here.
Right.
So you'll know somebody who has served with them before, or you'll know somebody who's on the staff of the organization where they're on the board. I mean, the staff see the worst of what happens at the board level, I think, often, right? I mean, don't you think?
Yep.
So it's a little bit more informal than you're not asking them to sign
It's not an
a
application.
waiver or anything like they were applying for a job, but it is that same process.
And it's an interesting kind of cause and effect. When you're developing a board that gets more engaged and more effective, more engaged and more effective people want to be on it.
Right.
And it takes a while. It's a transition. It can take 10 years. I mean, that's a long time. But you can watch as these boards transform from being sitting in the room and staring at each other and doing nothing to people who are really active. And you have to start, and then it snowballs. So,
And Alex,
oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, and I don't mean to jump ahead if you're going there, but do you advocate using what I call a covenant, a written covenant, which is what we're going to provide and what you're going to provide, and then we all sign it?
The board agreement.
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll give you $1. But yeah, that's part of this, is the engagement, is the agreement in writing. Now, it's not, we've talked to attorneys about this and their eyes get really big. It's not a legally binding contract. But if you put your name on something, you're going to think about it. Yeah.
Well, we've also seen a best practice where, say it's a 3-year board term, which is sort of standard, I believe, that you would, at the end of each year, you would revisit it. Because I know I'm on a board that we've been doing a lot of refreshing the last 2 years, and one of the people that we recruited and we thought would be fabulous has not done a thing, has not come to a meeting, has done nothing, and so we just, had the conversation that clearly this is not a match and just asked him to move on. But there are times where there are people who are sort of borderline, and so, or there are people that they represent a significant donor, so you don't want to upset the donor, and at the same time you'd like to get them more engaged. So it can be a tool for having that conversation. How can we get you just a little bit more engaged?
It also gives individual directors, we looked at 2 things. It's you survey the board as a whole, how effective are we as a board, and report on that. And that can ebb and flow from year to year. And then me as a director on this board, how effective have I been? And personal situations change. I might have been able to commit to a 3-year term 2 years ago, but something happened and I no longer could do that. And it gives everybody kind of a safe out. Either, this isn't a good match, maybe you ought to consider somewhere else, or me saying, you know what, I just can't do this anymore. And it's no hard feelings. It prevents the conversations like I've experienced in the last couple of years. It's not painful because everyone each year we have like a recommitment ceremony where we say, yeah, we're really in this. And it keeps everybody refreshed.
Yes.
Can you speak to for just a few minutes about organizations in their life cycles change, their leadership changes, their staff changes. And boards have to change along with those. Sometimes it's the board needs to become hands-on engaged until the new CEO or whatever can become in place. Can you speak to how do you escort a board back to being a policy board as opposed to being a hands-on board?
It's a challenge, isn't it? Once they get those fingers in, it's hard to get them out. So, yes, that is really an important role, I believe, of the chair of the board, really leads that effort. We are writing a series of articles for the Philanthropy Journal. I don't know, do y'all get the Philanthropy Journal? You know, so look back. They started 2 months ago, and it's coming Monday. So it's the third Monday of every month is when it's on there, and it's sort of a series that's addressing all this. That might help you some too. But I think it's just getting the chair on board with that, with the ED. I believe that whenever a board gets fingers in, it's either because the organization really has to have that because of something that's going on, and it can also be a sign that they don't have confidence in the CEO who's leading it. And so once you get, so if it is because of a transition, you get the new CEO in, they're doing well, then that CEO will need to maybe even teach the chair by saying, what do you need to know to be confident that I'm doing what I need to do so that you can go back to more of a governance kind of role. So I think it takes a lot of communication, and that happens every time there's a transition. Talk about buyer's remorse. I mean, it's been amazing. We do a leadership assessment or new leader assimilation for all of the people that we place. And a great story from a couple of years ago, what we do is we go in after they've been in place about 60 to 90 days, and we do a live 360 with the board and the staff. And so one of the comments that we got was, oh my gosh, this new ED had his program officer call us and tell us he was running late for a meeting. What is he doing? Is he treating them like his secretaries? Well, there was nothing further than the truth. His cell phone had died. He was running late for the meeting. And the quickest, most efficient way for the phone call to be made was to ask somebody who was sitting there in the office with a phone to call as he ran out the door. But she had made this, as board member, had made it into some big thing, and it was nothing. And so you see those kinds of things happen.
It's not so much as where I was going with that is the buyer remorse piece of it.
Okay.
That it becomes the culture of the board to be micromanaging.
Okay.
How do you get them back to the policy?
Okay. I think you have to figure out why are they micromanaging. First of all, is it lack of confidence, or is it just they like to do this stuff? And then figure out, you may have to change who's on the board and recruit people who don't want to do that. I think you have to figure out why, because I think there could be a multitude of reasons why. And maybe it could even be a conversation with some communication would help them realize, wow, I'd love to not be spending all of my every Monday here doing something in the office trying to help you what they think is helping, but it's interfering. Is that, I don't know, that may sound vague, but it's not, I don't think there's a, I think it's a process. That's communication and understanding what they want. And if that's not the role that you want for them, then you can go back to the board job descriptions and say, okay, let's get clear as to what the board job descriptions are now. And is this something that you still want to do? And do you understand? It's really, that's the other thing that's really interesting to me in looking at this dual leadership challenge is a lot of times the executive directors are the ones teaching the boards and developing the boards. We had a transition with Tammy Lynn Center. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Tammy Lynn Center in the Triangle. About 15 years ago when they brought someone in and they had no ED for a year. And that organization has very fragile children and adults living in their care. They're providing 24/7 care to very fragile people. And the board is primarily parents. And so when they finally got this new ED in, she knew what she wanted the board to be, and she knew it wasn't what she had. It probably took over 5 years to gradually transition the board, to bring in those business leaders, to exit some of the people, to change, help them define their roles better. So it's a lot of it is defining the role, I believe. And putting term limits.
That's term limits. Yeah, we've served on boards where there are no term limits. So you'll have people who've been on the board for 10 years. Yeah. We were working with a group, the chair was in his 6th year. That's a long time.
But I think it's a great question because if we recruit doesn't mean having your hands on everything. Teaching them how to have just an opposite function within the organization that they love.
That's right, and they should. You might want to have some gap years there. If you're talking about someone who's been staff and maybe they retired or moved to a different organization, but you still want them on your board. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
We're talking about a strong volunteer that has served for many years. And that also goes back to the point of looking at what they can bring to the board. Where passion is not enough. I mean, that's, you have a lot of people that are in there for the cause, which is fabulous, and you need that, because that's what keeps you going when things get a little bit drudgery, but that's not enough. So do they bring the business acumen you need? Do they bring, the talents that you need? And sometimes you have to say no. That this person might be a phenomenal volunteer, but the board is an advisory governance board. It's not an operating board, so we can't make that transition. And we didn't say this was easy. But to sustain the organization, it's necessary.
Does that help?
Does that help? Not saying it's easy.
I kind of approach of being in control when you went to a meeting, like to go to a meeting, and instead of saying, this is the issue, how do we solve it? I'd go to a meeting and say, this is how I suggest we solve it. These are some alternative scenarios. Kind of have it all taken care of, basically, so that they're kind of just approving what, how you think things, and kind of start to take some of that micromanagement, that power away. Not taking their power away as a board, but some of those little issues, show them I've got it under control. I know what the problem is. I know how to solve it. You guys agree? Yes, let's move on. And that seems to work.
And it becomes a trust issue, and it can be accidentally hurt in the past, but trust is built when you do what you say you're going to do. So as the leader, the executive director of the organization, the more you, like you said, I have it, I've done it, this is what I've done, this is what you've asked, this is what I've done, people are going to go, oh, okay, well, okay, good. And also just setting the expectations. This is the kind of board we have. This is what we need you to do. We don't need you to answer the phones. We need you to open a door for us.
Two questions. This audience, I would think, is a lot of people who often we're not really asked as a development person who ought to be on the board. And we are tending to want to see people who can help our fundraising efforts on that board. But if I hear you correctly, you're suggesting that the nomination process really be a mix of people that can help the board all across the spectrum, including being a good fundraising board.
Absolutely.
And then the other thing, so I'd like you to speak to that, if we have the mix right. And then the other thing is, when we get asked to serve on other people's boards as professionals, is it not true that we are generally being asked to sit on their board because we can help them with their fundraising plan?
I would think so.
And do you think that's appropriate?
It's interesting. We had this conversation with the attorneys. Somebody stated that people don't want attorneys on their boards. And that was kind of different. We like having attorneys on our boards, but it had to be very clear why they were on the boards. It wasn't to get free legal counsel. It was for them to give their perspective knowing that world. So you jump in, but it's interesting. There's a little bit of a conflict there. If you can't have an attorney on your board and then expect them to be your organization's attorney. That's a conflict of interest. Same thing with the fundraiser. It's bringing your talents to it and maybe your creativity, but they're not, I would assume, and it might be way wrong, not having you on the boards because you're a free fundraiser.
I mean, I'll just tell you, I have always said no for two reasons. Number one, they want me on the board for fundraising experience, and I said, I'll help you pro bono, but I don't want to sit on your board. And then the other reason is there are only so many significant gifts I can make to a nonprofit, and this one isn't going to be one of them. And I can't be on the board without advocating a significant financial gift myself. And
What's
so,
the response been when you've answered like that?
Most of the time, they'll say, you're right, and we'd like some help setting it up and doing some things, and I help them with that for a while, and then we both go our separate ways. But frankly, I've never been sorry for saying no to serving on this kind of nonprofit board. I've always thought it was the right thing to do. But a lot of people in here do that, so.
I would say that would probably, I tend to lean more towards your thinking, but I think it would depend on the individual organizations, and if they're, if you're going to be going to very different funders, that would be a way to, if, for example, I recruited someone to a board that I'm on who was doing fundraising, but it was in a very different sector, so we both agreed that it would not provide any conflict of interest. And there was a knowledge and skill set there. We wanted that she was passionate about it, but I think you have to be really careful about that. So I'm not sure where we are on our time.
Yeah, you've got about 20 minutes.
Okay, so why don't we, if y'all are okay, let's move to the CEO succession planning. And
Well, let me preface that by saying succession planning is the ultimate responsibility of the board, both for themselves and for the CEO. So that's kind of a novel idea.
yes. And not in the vacuum, just, back to your point, I'm shocked that your boards are not asking you who in the community should they be going after that would help with development. So I think I would encourage you to create those conversations with your boards.
Yeah, it's amazing. Sometimes they don't want to
Seems
hear.
like a pretty obvious thing to do first.
Yep.
So,
And whether that happens with the board or with your CEO.
yes.
Right.
Depending on who's leading that charge, exactly, because it can be.
Well, and who the appropriate pecking order is. It would probably, in our organization, would not be appropriate for me to go to the nominating committee and say, oh, ask these 4 people. I should go through the CEO and he takes it to the, so it would depend on the structure, I would think, within the organization, what would be the appropriate way to do that.
Well, and if you have a board committee that's around fund development or fundraising, then they should be talking to the board development committee. That's the way we do it. Board does. So that could also. All right. So the CEO succession planning. What's really fascinating is when we took a step back last year and looked at the many searches we've done for executive directors the last couple of years, we realized that there is a very, very long time frame that our organizations are going without their leader. And that's never good, particularly in a challenging fundraising time, which seems to be just always anymore. And the smaller the organization, the more critical it is, because you don't typically have a big staff underneath that CEO who can keep things going on a day-to-day basis really well. So what's causing that long period of time between leaders? And first of all, we found that it could take easily 3 months before the search committee was formed, an RFP was put out there, and a search firm was selected. So we could go in, and they're already 3 months into the volunteer leadership and all of that. And so, of course, it's stressful for the staff, it's stressful for your funders. We're all on annual cycles, so you can lose ground so fast. The other challenge we've seen is where when you get that committee together, then is this a group of people who can and will make it a priority to meet on a timely basis? So we had one situation this past year where an extra, I would say 2 months, was added to the process just because of delays in calendars of the committee coming back to do the final steps. Fortunately, we did not lose the candidate. It also, to me, it sort of looks badly on us because when it's out there in the world, it's like, wow, it took Elinvar a year to do that, and it didn't take us a year to do that, but it took them a year to do that. So in that case, it was a different scenario. It was a startup, so it was not such a bad thing. But those are things that they're basic but critical. So we believe that there's a lot that can be done up front, and I've got a checklist for you that you guys can pick up as you go out, so you don't have to worry about making lists. But we're hearing more and more that funders are wanting to see that there's a succession plan for the organization. Do y'all ever get asked that when you're out, when you're doing your fundraising or seeing a grant application? Okay, well, stay
Do
tuned.
you
I
have a
think-
rule of thumb for how large an organization should be in order to hire an executive search firm?
There's not a rule of thumb. I think that if you have a budget under $1 million, it's probably a lot harder to do. What we do, and I suspect some of the other consultants do, is you can hire someone to do pieces for you. So it's not a full-blown search, but you still get some of that outside facilitation that can be really, really valuable.
Okay,
And that
good.
can save you money.
Thanks.
So that's something to ask about and consider if you're smaller and don't have the budget. You can also, we're doing a search right now for a collaboration that has a very small budget, but they have one of their funders who's willing to fund the fee. So, you know, there's that capacity building work can help in that regard as well. And we also, if you think about the stress that everybody is under when there is not a CEO in place, and that stresses the board, it stresses the staff, then, you know, I have seen a rush to judgment where there's, you know, they just quickly want to fill that spot, and that doesn't always end up with the best results.
Here's a moment in the audience. I think there's some.
Is there a story? Somebody will share? Yes.
Yeah, I'll share a story without naming names or anything like that. But yeah, I've seen, you kind of made me think of something similar along the same lines, which is I've also seen groups, because they're eager to get somebody in place, to sort of not take into account so much what they need in that role as what the organization is itself. And I'm just to clarify what I'm trying to say here. I mean, I've seen people hire a person who, like, if it's a creative organization, they're looking for this super creative person, but really, I was in a situation like this with the creative group, and really what they needed was just the opposite.
Yeah.
They needed somebody who was just all about discipline, making sure that the bills were paid on time, and that the messages that were going out were, you know, very clearly communicated and very simple. And instead, they kind of brought in this creative person who sort of just wowed the group,
Yeah.
and could kind of spin all these really good sounding sorts of things initially, but it was just kind of a veneer and didn't really accomplish what the organization needed. So, you know, I've seen kind of that skipping over, you know, what are we actually looking for in this person that they're going to make the organization work, not just kind of look like the way the organization looks to the public.
And that's critical, and we'll get to some details on that in just a second, so thank you for that. So the board, you know, getting back to the board's role for a minute, is the board's #1 responsibility is having a good, effective CEO in place theoretically all the time, right? So they're responsible for the interim leadership, so you always want to make sure there's someone on your board who is available. This is the one big lesson I got at Harvard, because it took me back. I hadn't thought about it before, that you need to have somebody on your board who can step in and be an effective interim leader who is not going to be wanting the job. And so it's great to, like, right now I'm vice chair of the organization. Our chair is retired, and she's already said, because we really think we've got about 2 years left. We have a young, bright, sparkly, and amazing ED, and he's not, I don't think he's going to stay with us a whole lot longer. So, you know, we already have that sort of known, which is really good. And then you need to not let everybody disappear after the search. You have to really convince your, we like to see the current and future chair, board chair, whoever headed the search committee, and whoever did the interim leadership as a minimum, sort of form a little ad hoc committee that shepherds that ED through, and that just depends on the complication of your organization and so on and so forth. But, you know, at least the first 3 to 6 months. It doesn't have to be super intensive, but it can be. So it just depends on what's needed to make it really successful. So another element that you want to make sure you have is for short and long term. You may have someone out for a couple of months or for surgery or something. And so you want to make sure that you know who in the staff can take care of what. You know, how would you divvy up those responsibilities? Would a board member need to step up and start signing checks, for example? Or, you know, what are just the day-to-day kinds of things and the little bit bigger picture things? maybe, but definitely the day-to-day operating things. You want things well documented and planned so that if something suddenly happens, then you know you can move quickly into action and know good things get lost in the process. And you also have planned, such as retirements, which is wonderful because then you have a lot of time to do this well. You don't have to worry about interim leadership. But then sometimes, you know, the board gets to a point where they realize they have to create the exit scenario, or that person is wonderful and gets a fabulous opportunity to go into the next gig, and the board's not expecting that. So, you know, you need to make sure you have good detailed plans for all of those. This also causes you to really look at what's your staff. What's really interesting that I hear from my corporate friends on this topic is they think, well, you should be developing your successor and you should always have that next grade ED right there next to you in an organization. Well, most of our nonprofits do not have the budget for that. They don't have the work for that. There's great work for a really good leader, and then you've got good operations people. They're not always, in fact, they're often not the same person. No matter how great your operations person is, they're not the visionary, or they're not the person who's going to go out and be the face of the community, or whatever it is that you need in your ED. So I think it's rare that you can bring in, and you have to be a much bigger organization to really be able to do the kind of succession planning you see in corporate America. So when they look at you funny, just look at them funny.
We've also seen, they say, especially EDs who've been in the role for 20 years, 30 years, and they're second. People naturally assume that second should take over the ED role upon their retirement. But we offer that really strong leaders aren't happy being seconds for 20 to 30 years. And they want it sooner. So it's not always a natural movement to take that person into the leadership role, because they might be the best second. And it's all about the abilities for the candidate.
And exactly what you were talking about is that profile. What do you need to be successful?
Should the exiting CEO be involved in the search process?
Great
It's
question.
been on the whole league with some sort of
Right.
We have found it does vary based on the personalities. Back to the people are messy. We do not believe they should have a vote. They definitely should have a voice. And there need to be conversations without that person in the room, because no matter how wonderful of a job they are doing and have done, whenever that seat is being vacated, is always looking at, okay, where are we in our succession planning? What opportunity does this open up for us to maybe take a different direction? Do you have a different need? For example, the CD I'm anticipating us losing in the next couple of years. I believe our next person, he had to really turn around an organization that was almost gone. And he's done that because he's a very outward facing, very, very great at that. I believe in 2 more years, we'll be much more in that operating, a good quality, growing program phase. And so I think we will want a different skill set in the next one. So those conversations, we're not going to have those conversations and prompt our ED leader. He's wonderful, we love him, but so for that reason, I think it's hard to have those people sit and listen to that, because they all care so much about the work they're doing that somehow they're going to feel like, oh, I didn't do something well.
And it's hard. I mean, they're humans, and they've given a lot to the organization, and it's incredibly difficult to be objective when you're talking about your job. So it's not fair to them to be part of those in-depth conversations.
And on this list of things, as we're running, just one second, we're running out of time, and this is important. With your search committee selection, you want to make sure that everyone on your search committee really, you want a diversity of viewpoints, but you also want people who really trust each other and work well together. Now that may seem like a silly thing to say, but we have experienced a very dysfunctional search committee, and it is not productive or good for anyone. So you make sure that there are people who can really work well together on this. Yes?
Any rules of or advice on whether the retiring CEO should immediately join the board?
I would say not. Yeah. They should have a gap, at least one gap there. Okay, so I think we have time for maybe one more question.
You know, I'm always shy about talking, but to me, it's really an interesting concept to really have a plan. And then you said, the last slide, planned and unplanned. And I think in the process of that, we also ought to have a plan for crisis/scandal. Because we all say that could never happen to us, but it sure does sometimes. But I like the idea of the succession plan when it's not expected.
Well, a perfect example of the crisis communication and it being done as poorly as anyone can see is what happened with COVID 2 years ago. And we were actually starting the search for a new leader for the COVID affiliate. Susan G. Komen, national. And right as that was all happening, and that was quite interesting, as you can imagine.
Yeah, I lived through the Covenant House scandal way a long time ago, which y'all don't remember, but we need to be ready.
Yes, because it happens. Yeah, whether we, well, and Progress Energy, Duke Energy now, it was Progress Energy, they are, and they're a private, you know, they're a for-profit organization, but they are such a great example of what effective succession planning can be, because their CEO dropped dead on a sidewalk in Europe. And we have good friends that are in that leadership, and they already had the plan. So there was no break in leadership. They were all mourning, but they already knew, every senior executive knew what was going to happen next because they stopped and had that conversation. And it's not an easy conversation, because don't we all want to think we're going to be here forever? For one, you know, we're never going to have a gap. We're never going to have unplanned absences, but it's got to be made. It's very important. So clearly, so our title was Harvard and Hard Knocks, but looking at it, Patti, the Harvard experience was phenomenal, but most of the stuff we learned is really hard knocks. I mean, and I think this room could probably share far more stories than we have.
And can I just make a comment that I know you've been talking a lot, mostly in terms of CEOs, but I think organizations need to be prepared for their seconds to be gone, or holes within their senior staff. That if the organization is smaller and there's only 5 people there anyway, and a hole there, the CEO may not have a clue how to fill that hole.
Yes, right.
And so it's not just succession planning for your board and your CEO, but it's for the whole organization, I think. And a lot of times we don't think about that till, oh my God, who can add 2 and 2 and get 4 twice? And how are we going to get the checks out the door?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Very good point.
So it's the balance. You know, the dual leadership, doesn't fall on one or the other, but it is all about the leadership. So thank you very much for your time today.
Because leadership matters. We're not quiet people. And I love that we've been in a room with people who are not quiet people. And so we appreciate the opportunity to share our thoughts today.
Thank you very much. Very kind to stay to our clock, but if you have questions, I know that they're willing to talk with you further. And also, may we email you if we have follow-up questions?
I would love that.
Okay,
on
great.
The handouts.
Thank you all. We'll see you at the Renaissance November 14th for our next month's meeting. Thanks.